The Earth is in the middle between Mars and Venus, but Venus should not be so hot. It should be warm.
Buried in Cold War vaults and hidden from the world for decades, the Soviet Union's long-lost Venus images have finally been exposed, and what they show has scientists in a full-blown panic.
One of the first things that I noticed was a conical pyramid in the distance.
Even Joe Rogan's reaction, when he hears about these newly declassified Soviet photos from Venus, says it all. Why are we only seeing this now? These aren't ordinary photos.
With the most recent revelations coming from a late astronaut who served the Soviet Union at its peak.
They come from forgotten probes launched before most people alive today were even born. And when modern technology enhances the images, what appears in them leaves even hardened space experts speechless. This isn't just about Venus. This is about what might be watching us from a world we thought was dead. This is the terrifying truth that Soviet scientists never wanted to be revealed. The Forgotten Planet. Why Venus was abandoned. Venus was never supposed to be forgotten. In the early days of the space race, the Soviet Union didn't just study Venus, they obsessed over it. While America looked toward the red deserts of Mars, the Soviets poured resources, technology, and lives into unlocking the secrets of a planet that almost no one talks about today. But why? From the 1960s through the 1980s, the USSR became the world leader in Venus exploration. Their planetary program, known as the Venera program, was both ambitious and relentless. They launched over 30 missions to Venus, and while many failed, several broke records. Venera 7 became the first spacecraft to land on another planet and transmit data back to Earth in 1970. Later, Venera 9 and 10 sent back the first black and white images of Venus's surface, showing a landscape littered with jagged rocks under a thick, toxic sky. But Venus is no place for life as we know it. Its surface reaches over 900 degrees Fahrenheit, 475 degrees Celsius, which is hot enough to melt lead. Its atmosphere is a choking soup of carbon dioxide with clouds of sulfuric acid, and the pressure on the surface is 90 times that of Earth, almost like being 3,000 feet underwater. Landers sent to Venus were crushed, melted, and destroyed within minutes or hours. In contrast, Mars, though cold and barren, was dry, stable, and full of potential. It had a thin atmosphere, no acid rain, and wasn't trying to crush or melt anything that touched down. So by the late 1980s, Venus was quietly abandoned by most of the scientific world. Western countries, especially the US, shifted almost entirely to Mars exploration. NASA's Viking landers, Mars rovers, and orbiters became the stars of the show. Mars was the future. Venus was a lost cause. But oddly, the Soviets didn't stop as early as everyone else. Even as their economy weakened and their space program struggled, they continued Venus missions longer than any other country. Their final probe, Vega 2, was launched in 1984, carrying a lander and a balloon to study the Venusian atmosphere. Despite the odds, the Soviets pushed deeper into Venus research than anyone had before or since. Why? That's the question that still puzzles historians and scientists. Was it pure stubbornness? National pride? Or did they discover something they didn't want the world to know? This obsession with such a hostile planet seems unusual unless the Soviets believed it was worth the risk. Something about Venus kept them coming back. There was something about Venus that was worth concealing. And now, decades later, declassified archives suggest they may have found exactly what they were looking for. The Venus program was written off by many as a dead end, but in the shadows of the Cold War, the Soviet Union may have captured something extraordinary and then buried it. The USSR's secret obsession, Venera and the unknown data. If the Cold War had a defining characteristic, it was secrecy. Both the United States and the Soviet Union guarded their scientific and military advancements like state treasures. But while the US often publicized its space triumphs, the USSR treated even peaceful discoveries as classified assets. Nowhere was that more obvious than in their handling of the Venera program. Its bold, relentless mission to conquer the most hostile planet in the solar system, Venus. The Venera program was a remarkable display of scientific persistence, as Venus is one of the most hostile environments in the solar system. Yet Soviet engineers kept sending landers there, each more advanced than the last. Venera 7 made history in 1970 as the first probe to transmit data from another planet's surface. It survived just 23 minutes before the heat and pressure silenced it forever. But Venera 13 changed everything. In 1981, it landed, endured for over 2 hours, and sent back something no one expected: full-color images, audio from the surface, and chemical analysis of the Venusian soil. And then, just as quickly, the information vanished. Yes, a few pictures made the rounds. Yes, we've all seen the grainy, orange-hued rocks under an alien sky. But where was the rest? Where were the full image sets, the environmental scans, the uncompressed files, and the complete telemetry logs? What scientists received was curated, filtered. Key metadata was missing. Entire frames were blurred, cropped, or outright deleted. Unlike NASA, which flooded the public with data from Apollo, Viking, and Voyager, the USSR shared select results like temperature readings, brief audio clips, and a handful of images, but many frames were missing. The famous Venera 13 and 14 images, for example, show wide-angle shots of a rocky surface under a dull orange haze, but experts noticed the contrast was altered. Certain areas were strangely blurred, and entire sections of telemetry were absent. In some cases, metadata, which is the background information that tells scientists when and how data was captured, was simply missing. In contrast, NASA made a habit of releasing almost everything. From the moon landings to Mars rover selfies, American space data was considered public domain. Scientists around the world could analyze the same files and debate their meaning. But with the Venera missions, there was always a curtain. The USSR released just enough to prove the missions happened, and then held everything else back. They shared just enough to raise more questions than answers. But why? At the time, some believed it was just Cold War paranoia. Others suspected the data was too poor to be useful. If it was nothing, why hide it? If it was meaningless, why bury it? Venus is an unforgiving planet, but it's not impossible to study. The fact that the USSR put so much effort into landing there and then withheld so much suggests there might be more to the story. Especially now, as declassified images begin to surface, revealing strange anomalies that weren't part of the official record. Was the Soviet obsession with Venus about proving technical superiority? Or were they hiding the biggest scientific discovery of the 20th century? Something happened. And whatever it was, these newly declassified Soviet photos from Venus brings us one step closer to the truth. Clues in the cracks, the strange shapes on the surface. By the 2010s, the Soviet Union had long since collapsed, but the fog of secrecy surrounding its space missions lingered. Most of the data from the Venera program had never been properly archived or widely studied, until one Russian scientist decided to look closer. His name was Leonid Ksanfomality, a veteran researcher at Russia's Space Research Institute and someone who had worked closely on planetary imaging. In 2012, Ksanfomality dropped a bombshell. After reanalyzing the images taken by Venera 13, a probe that had landed on Venus in 1982, he claimed there were signs of movement on the planet's surface. Not random shifts, but objects that appeared to change position between frames, despite the lander itself being stationary. Among the shapes he pointed out were 3 main anomalies. The first was disc-shaped object that seemed to appear and vanish across different images. The second was a scorpion-shaped form that, in one frame, cast a shadow in one direction and then cast it in another. This was something that shouldn't happen with a fixed light source. The third was a flap, or mechanical-looking piece that Ksanfomality said looked like it had shifted location or disappeared between frames. Ksanfomality didn't outright declare these objects to be signs of alien life, but he did strongly suggest they were not random. In his words, the shapes exhibited the features of a living organism. These claims, made in a peer-reviewed Russian journal, quickly spread across the internet and into fringe science circles. Western scientists immediately pushed back. NASA and planetary imaging experts argued that the anomalies were simply artifacts caused by lens flares, data glitches, or environmental effects on aging Soviet technology. They noted that Venus has a thick, toxic atmosphere that could distort light, and that the imaging equipment aboard the Venera landers was primitive by modern standards. But some independent analysts weren't so quick to dismiss the claims. A handful of image specialists and UFO researchers pointed out that some shadows in the images appeared to change direction, which would be difficult to explain with static objects and a stationary lander. Others noted that certain forms had visible outlines and textures, suggesting they weren't just errors, but possibly physical structures or organisms. Even more intriguing was the timing. Sanfomality's claims came not long after a new wave of scientific interest in Venus began to emerge, particularly around the question of life in its atmosphere. While most scientists still treat Sanfomality's claims with caution or outright skepticism, there's no denying one thing. His analysis reawakened global curiosity about the missing pieces of Soviet Venus data. What if the objects he identified weren't glitches, but something far more important? Whether the anomalies were biological, mechanical, or something else entirely remains a mystery. But Sanfomality did more than re-examine old photographs. He cracked open the door the Soviets had shut decades ago. And whatever's still hidden in those frames, we haven't seen the last of it. The photos they never wanted you to see. In 2023, an unassuming archive room in Moscow, long buried in red tape and Soviet dust, unexpectedly offered up a mystery. A researcher digging through Cold War-era space records stumbled upon a batch of undeclared Soviet photos taken during the Venera missions to Venus. These images had never appeared in scientific journals or press briefings, or even in the Soviet Union's own science reports. They were from the Venera 13 and Venera 14 probes, both of which landed on Venus in 1982. The photos, stored in fragile film canisters, showed surface conditions in black and white and limited color of mostly rocks, soil, and Venus's orange-tinted haze, but several frames stood out. Some were clearly blurred or cropped, with unnatural shadows and missing timestamps. A few showed signs of physical tampering, with scratch marks across areas that should have contained key visual data. Others had peculiar fog-like patterns near the surface, or odd geometric shapes that didn't match known equipment or debris. Analysts quickly suspected intentional censorship, because it was as though certain details had been scrubbed or blocked before the photos ever saw the light of day. When digital experts fed the images into modern AI enhancement software, things got stranger. The AI reconstructed some of the blurred sections and sharpened others. In several frames, biological-looking textures began to emerge. They appeared to resemble branch-like filaments, cell-like clusters, and ripple patterns that didn't align with geology. More surprising was the visual trace of gas emissions that appeared to originate from cracks in the ground. Scientists familiar with recent Venus studies noted the patterns were strangely similar to phosphine emissions, a chemical often associated with microbial life. For decades, the idea of life on Venus was a dead conversation. The planet's surface, hot enough to melt lead and filled with acidic clouds, seemed utterly inhospitable. But here were Soviet photos from the early 1980s suggesting strange emissions and possibly some form of organic activity, long before anyone was seriously considering the possibility. The release of these images shocked planetary scientists, many of whom had written off Venus as little more than a scientific graveyard. Now, they were asking hard questions. Why were these photos hidden? Who made the decision to withhold them? And perhaps most importantly, what exactly did those emissions mean? In planetary science, phosphine does not simply appear out of nowhere. It has to come from somewhere, and when it's coming from the surface of Venus, the implications could be enormous. The phosphine puzzle, a clue from Earth's twin. Venus has long been called Earth's twin. It's similar in size, gravity, and composition, but with one fatal difference. It's a planetary hell. Temperatures reach nearly 900 degrees Fahrenheit. The atmosphere is thick with carbon dioxide and cloaked in sulfuric acid clouds. For decades, this toxic world was written off as dead, geologically quiet and biologically impossible. That changed in 2020. In a surprise announcement, a team of astronomers led by Jane Greaves at Cardiff University reported something shocking. Phosphine gas had been detected in Venus's upper atmosphere. On Earth, phosphine is rare and unstable. It's typically produced by microbes in oxygen-poor environments, like swamps or animal guts. While it can be made industrially, in nature, it's almost always tied to life. The scientific community erupted. Some claimed it was an instrument error. Others suggested it could be the result of unknown geological activity or an overlooked chemical process. Still, the detection was impossible to ignore. If phosphine was really there, and in significant amounts, it might suggest microbial life floating in Venus's acidic clouds. For years, the findings sat in limbo, too wild to confirm, too big to dismiss. Greaves and her team returned with new data from the Atacama Large Millimeter Submillimeter Array in Chile, backed by space-based observations. Their conclusion? Phosphine is real, and it's more abundant and stable than previously thought. Even more surprising, they detected phosphine not just in the upper atmosphere, but in deeper layers, with concentrations that remained steady over time. That stability meant it wasn't a transient event. Something, possibly something alive, was actively producing it. That's when things got even stranger. Analysts began connecting dots. One of the recently declassified Soviet photographs, quietly released from a Moscow archive in 2023, showed what appeared to be a low-lying haze near the Venusian surface. It had long been dismissed as heat distortion or camera noise. But when researchers enhanced the image and revisited the mission's telemetry logs, they noticed something strange. One of the lander's infrared readings, captured during the same frame, showed a spike in absorption at wavelengths now associated with phosphine. At the time, this was dismissed as noise or interference. But with modern spectral libraries and gas models, the pattern lines up closely with what we now consider a phosphine signature. Combined with the strange visual haze in the photo, the correlation was hard to ignore. It suggested that Venera may have not only captured an unexplained atmospheric anomaly, it may have recorded the chemical footprint of life nearly 4 decades ago. Here's where it becomes chilling. The Soviets never published the image. It wasn't included in any Venera mission report. The photo was archived with missing metadata, scratches obscuring key sections, and no record of follow-up analysis. It looked less like a discarded frame and more like something intentionally buried. Did the USSR detect phosphine before anyone else? And if so, why didn't they say anything? Was it fear of global panic? Or did they suspect something even more terrifying? That life was hiding in the most extreme corner of the solar system, and it wasn't ready to be found? The connection between modern science and long-forgotten Soviet data is hard to ignore. What the West rediscovered in 2020 and confirmed in 2024 may have already been captured by a Soviet lander in 1982. Unlike telescopes scanning clouds from millions of miles away, the Soviets had mechanical boots on the ground. They didn't just detect phosphine from afar. They may have photographed it seeping from the rocks. Now, as experts revisit the photos, data logs, and mission records, one disturbing possibility grows louder. We've had signs of life on Venus for decades, and someone decided we weren't ready to know. The shocking reveal: declassified photos confirm life. The phosphine mystery was no longer confined to Venus's clouds. After the 2024 reconfirmation and the chilling Soviet photographs suggesting a phosphine haze near the surface, interest in old Venus mission data surged. That's when a quiet group of planetary scientists and data specialists began digging deeper, not just into the images, but into the raw telemetry and environmental logs transmitted from the Venera 13 lander in 1982. Using modern AI enhancement and spectral correlation tools, the team reprocessed a long-dismissed image frame previously considered unusable due to glare and surface distortion. What emerged was not just clearer rock structure, but something far stranger. Etched across a piece of foreground terrain was a hexagonal pattern. At first, it appeared geological, but the geometry repeated across multiple points with a symmetry and density that hinted at something more organized, possibly even biological. These weren't simple cracks or mineral veins. Some argued the formations resembled microbial colonies or biofilms adapted to Venus's punishing surface conditions. And the pattern wasn't the only anomaly. When researchers aligned the photo with archived Venera infrared telemetry, they found a spike in localized radiation absorption, nearly identical to what modern models now associate with phosphine. That same spike aligned precisely with the site of the hexagonal pattern. More startling still, a comparison of sequential frames showed slight shifts in the cluster patterns, subtle but consistent enough to suggest the surface wasn't static. Whether this hinted at active biological processes or extreme environmental interaction remained uncertain, but it couldn't be ignored. One researcher said, "This wasn't some cloud formation or spectral blip from space. This was structural, chemical, and possibly dynamic, and it happened under our feet, not above our heads." But the final twist came not from science, but from history. Among the declassified documents accompanying the Venera image set was an internal 1983 memo from a Soviet planetary research office. The document flagged the image frame in question and advised that it be withheld from publication due to surface geometry and spectral values inconsistent with known mineral data. A follow-up note discouraged further circulation outside of controlled research environments. To some, it was bureaucratic caution. To others, it was a quiet directive. bury what we're not ready to explain. Now, 4 decades later, that buried frame and its chemical trace have resurfaced, and for the first time, the pieces form a chilling possibility. That the first visual and chemical evidence of extraterrestrial life wasn't found in distant clouds or icy moons, but right on the scorched crust of Venus. The implications are staggering. We may not be alone, we may never have been, and the first proof of that may have been sitting in a Soviet archive all along. Inside the scientific community, the shock is giving way to something deeper: panic. Why scientists are panicking? The discovery of possible microbial life on Venus has not sparked excitement. It has triggered unease, even fear, in the scientific community. At the SETI Institute, one researcher summarized the mood bluntly: "We weren't just wrong, we missed it. And now we have to ask what else we've missed." That's the source of the panic. Not just the life, but the implications of the oversight. For decades, Venus was dismissed as uninhabitable. The new findings suggest life can exist in conditions previously thought impossible: high heat, crushing pressure, and acidic atmospheres. That alone upends foundational assumptions about where life can thrive. But the panic deepens with the realization that this evidence was buried for 40 years. If microbial biosignatures were overlooked or suppressed in the Venera data, it raises serious concerns about how scientific institutions, shaped by politics and assumptions, may have failed. Already, NASA, ESA, and Roscosmos have begun early discussions about returning to Venus. Proposed missions range from atmospheric probes and robotic landers to orbiters equipped with AI-driven chemical sensors. But a new concern looms: contamination. If there's an active microbial ecosystem on Venus, introducing Earth-based microbes, even by accident, could corrupt or erase it, skewing results or destroying what we've just found, and vice versa. Venusian microbes brought back unknowingly could interact unpredictably with Earth's biosphere. The protocols for planetary protection were never designed for a discovery this close, this extreme, or this ambiguous. To many researchers, the biggest fear isn't life itself. It's that we already found it and didn't recognize or admit what we were seeing. The idea that alien life has been quietly surviving next door, unnoticed or intentionally suppressed, is a crushing blow to scientific confidence. And as panic spreads, the questions mount. Who made the call to suppress the data? Why weren't these photos reanalyzed sooner? And if we got Venus wrong, what else have we missed? This isn't just a scientific turning point, it's a reckoning. What happens now? In the coming months, this revelation will likely remain under wraps, shared only within tightly controlled scientific and political circles. The public won't see the full images or hear the unfiltered reports. Fears of panic, misinformation, and geopolitical fallout will likely keep the data classified, or slowly trickled out through curated academic papers. Governments will act before they speak. Behind closed doors, the US, the European Space Agency, ESA, and India will likely accelerate their Venus mission timelines. NASA's long-delayed Veritas mission will probably regain funding and urgency. ESA's Envision, originally focused on mapping Venusian geology, may now be tasked with a direct search for biosignatures. India's space agency, already hinting at interest in Venus, could fast-track its Shukrayan-1 orbiter, aiming for launch within the next few years. Meanwhile, Russia, the alleged original holder of the suppressed data, may see this as a rare opportunity to reclaim scientific prestige and atone for its silence. After years of declining space influence, the Kremlin could revive a Venera-style program, branding itself as the first nation to discover alien life, even if it never announced it at the time. A renewed Venus initiative could become a powerful political tool, repositioning Russia at the forefront of planetary science. Private space companies won't sit still either. SpaceX, Rocket Lab, and others will likely propose deep atmosphere drones and high-pressure landers designed to reach areas of Venus that are too extreme for traditional hardware. These ventures may frame themselves not just as technological pioneers, but as the first non-government explorers in the search for alien life. But amid the political shifts and technological proposals, the scientific world faces a deeper philosophical and ethical crossroads. Venus, once dismissed as a planetary inferno, may now be treated as a living world, with real debates about contamination, access, and the moral limits of exploration. Expect fierce arguments over planetary protection, data transparency, and whether international cooperation can withstand national agendas. Beyond all of this, the public will likely start asking deeper questions. If life can survive the crushing pressure, scorching heat, and acidic clouds of Venus, where else could it be hiding? Beneath the ice crust of Europa? In the methane haze of Titan? In the red dust of Mars? And then comes the final, haunting thought. If life has been clinging to Venus all along, is there something out there looking for us, just like we've been looking for them? The answers won't come quickly, but the race to find them is only just beginning. What do you think about these declassified photos? Thank you for watching. See you next time.